Okay, we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Very glad to have everybody here. We have the chat going with us today. I have Vincent Go. He is going to be here answering questions in the chat. And so today we have with us a very special guest. We have Chris Hodgson. My name is Wes McDermott. I'm Integrations Product Manager at Algorithmic. And so today, like I said, we're very thrilled to have Chris. So Chris, you want to say hello?
Hey, no, it's good to be here. It's nice to be able to share some stuff today.
Yeah, it's really awesome to have you, Chris. For those joining, Chris was actually our latest AAA artist who released 18 high-quality sci-fi materials as part of our signature material release. They are now available on Substance Source. The materials are fantastic, Chris. I'm also a pretty big sci-fi fan myself. So yeah, it was really cool to look at what you did.
Awesome.
So also, everybody, just before we get started here, I just want to let you know, so we have the chat going, and if you have any questions, just please post them in the chat. Be sure that you tag it with @algorithmic, and like I said, Vincent is monitoring our chat. Hey, Vincent. And he'll be able to answer questions, direct them to myself so that we can get those over to Chris. Chris is going to run through one of his materials. It's going to be the Sci-fi storage unit wall material. And then afterwards, we're going to have a little bit of time for some Q&A. One more thing before we start to get going here, I just want to remind everybody that we have Substance Day is coming up here in Los Angeles. It's going to be at the Noman School. It's going to be Wednesday, October 17th, 7 to 10 p.m. So if you can attend, we'd love to see you. Drop by. All right. So before we just jump right in, Chris, I'd like to just have you tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, I can do that. So yeah, I mean, I've pretty much worked in video games my sort of entire career. You know, apart from those early jobs you have when you're coming out of school and stuff. But yeah, so I graduated and went straight into video game production, and worked in the UK originally with some smaller companies. Eventually, working my sort of way up to like a senior environment artist, working at Ubisoft in in Newcastle, the Reflection Studio. I worked on Watch Dogs and Tom Clancy's The Division. And then I moved over to Sweden, and I've been working there with Starbreeze on Payday 2 DLC, as well as the Walking Dead game. And yeah, recently I've moved over to the States, to LA, to work at Naughty Dog, which is sort of a dream of mine that's been in a long time in the pipe. So yeah, now I'm working as a texture artist, basically a texture material artist in LA with Naughty Dog, using Substance Designer, primarily as my tool of choice every day. So it's yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, that's incredible, Chris, and congratulations. Excuse me, congratulations on the job at Naughty Dog. That's certainly a dream position to have.
Yeah.
So yeah, Chris, I just want to ask you. So we approached you about doing the signature material series, and so how did that go? Did we give you the option to choose which materials you wanted to work on?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of it's a project or an opportunity that doesn't really come along very often, because usually in development you have a very strict sort of set guideline of, like, the style of the game will dictate exactly what you have to do. But this was an open choice that the Algorithmic gave me, and I get to do basically what inspires me, what I want to do. So for me, it was quite an obvious thing. I'm a big sci-fi fan, so I chose to do sci-fi that inspired by all the things that have inspired me, over the years, and literally since I was very young. So it's a dream project, and I really got to do what I wanted to do, and there was not really. I didn't feel like I had to do specific things to please somebody else. It was truly my own stuff. So it was really great.
That's awesome. Yeah, and it sounds like you had just a lot of fun doing this.
Yeah, incredible fun.
Yeah, just curious too, like for each of these materials, about how long did it take you to create this drop?
Well, I mean, it's hard to sort of equate because like when you're doing something like this that you want to put out there and make sure it's it's the whole world's going to see it. Like you probably spend more time on it than you would in production. But I mean, like every material is probably at least a few man days. And man days being like unit of measurement for game industry. So like a working day basically. So it's a few between 2 and 4 sort of man days, but maybe in production you might spend half the time on that, or depending on the material complexity as well. Some are way more complicated than others, but yeah, it varies. But the simpler materials you could definitely do them in like 2 days.
Yeah, and there's a lot of variation too. Like, I'm just kind of looking through a lot of the materials as we're talking here, and you have like environments, you have skins, you have paneling and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, it's the thing I liked about the drop. Again, like I was telling you earlier, being kind of a sci-fi fan myself, was I liked that you had such a kind of a broad range of different types of materials as well.
Yeah, no, that was the goal really. Like I didn't want to just because I obviously was going to be doing the project for some time. I didn't want to be in a situation where I'm getting bored of my own work, I suppose. So I wanted to have enough variety to keep me, make it super exciting for me as well. So like every time I started a new material, it was a completely new thing that I analyze. What am I going to do? And I didn't feel pressured into any direction in particular. So it's good.
Yeah, it's cool. Like right now, I'm looking at one of the materials you had. It's like it's kind of like a retro like paneling. You've got some monitors, some switches and stuff. Reminds me of I don't know if you can actually see the screen capture that I'm showing.
Yeah, no, I can. Yeah.
Oh yeah, this one here. Yeah, reminds me of like 2001 or something like that, which was always so cool.
Yeah.
I remember that when I was a kid. So yeah, this was awesome.
Yeah, it's supposed to be like super retro. It's. Then that one uses a few sort of more advanced techniques, maybe with like randomization and stuff. So, but yeah, it's supposed to be just super retro sci-fi sort of 70s, late 70s, early 80s kind of stuff.
Yeah. So really amazing work, man. It was so inspiring to see all this. And so I guess the next thing we're going to do is you're going to walk us through a material. So everyone's excited to see that, myself included. So I'm going to stop screen sharing here, and we'll let you kind of take over here, Chris.
Yeah, I can do the screen share now. So how is it that I do the screen share? I've kind of forgot for some reason.
Oh yeah, it's kind of weird. Like in the.
Oh, there we go. It's okay. I found it. I got it. Okay, so can you see my substance?
Yes, we can.
Yep. Awesome. So yeah, so I already have the material loaded up here, and I've got the 3D view down below on the rounded cube with tessellation activated. It's actually tessellation is not activated, so I'm going to do that now. Just give a little bit of depth. Okay. So normally I would have this 3D view like off to the right on my second monitor, and I actually usually have the 2D view here and have it quite small because you just zoom straight in and it's very easy to pinpoint details. And then this whole graph space would take up this area as well, so I can have more real estate for the graph, because the graphs can get pretty big, and this is certainly not like the biggest of any that I've made. So yeah, usually I mean with this project I found I spent a very long time gathering reference, like huge amounts of reference, but for today I've sort of split that off into one file with all of my reference in, some of the reference in that I use for this project, for this substance, sorry. So yeah,
Chris, right before you get started, that's a really good question, because we get a lot of people ask this. Like, so you're talking about starting your substance and gathering reference and things like that. So a substance like this, it looks pretty complex in terms of the amount of detail and things like that you have. So can you just walk us through just kind of your thought process behind starting a substance?
Yeah, so I usually, I have an idea in mind of what I want to make it. I mean, at the end of the day, it's sci-fi, so you are creating something new. You're not just copying something in the environment, although you're going to be inspired by real world things all the time for material definition and such. But yeah, so I usually have for this one, I was like, oh, I want to make some panels, some like storage unit type thing on a wall, because it's going to be pretty flat and it's going to probably work as a substance, because you can pretty much extrude it straight out of a plane. So it should work as a texture with height and things. So I already kind of remembered watching film. Alien is the big inspiration for this one. So like they have some panels on a wall, and I remembered that from watching it. But then I went through, and so like I have my PureF file here, and it's very much inspired by this one. It's kind of in shadow, and it has some similar details and stuff. So that was kind of like, oh, I've always seen that shot in that film. I really want to do something like that. And then, from there, I just went and found other pictures from other, like there's some game reference here. There's some other film reference, some more Alien reference, some more games, some Doom stuff there, some Halo. And so, yeah, I'll just found a lot of the sci-fi stuff that really inspires me. But also some of these shots, like this one, it's nice to find. I mean, it's a bit blurry because it's obviously from a film, but it's nice to find some reference of like specular detail on the surface, some dirt. Like you get to really see like how old these materials are. Like this thing here is like very dirty, and the material that I made in the end, has like an age slider that allows you to take it from clean to very sort of dirty in the end. So this kind of stuff's really important to find, reference for the actual material quality. I had some more references as well for this material, but it's in such a big file that I just extracted out the ones that were the sort of like I suppose most important. But yeah, it's good to find reference for the actual surface detail as well as shapes, like is mainly here. So yeah, I do that, and then the moving into Substance, I always I always start from like the default, one of the default presets, and I always start with my height details, because the height basically defines everything in the material. Really, everything else can come from the height, or like can be easily you can easily get it from the height. So this graph uses a few different. This substance uses a few different graphs. So these graphs here are subgraphs that get brought in. But obviously, you start with the main file first. And yeah, Substance is so organic that it's like, the way that's kind of what I like about it. It's so organic the way that you work that, I started with this. But it's kind of hard to tell, like, did I start with this or did I start with this? But I actually started with this, this main shape, because I knew I wanted to have 4 of them. And then as other graphs get brought in, maybe I split them off, or I started them new and then dragged the graph in to plug it in. But it's a very sort of natural process of moving things around, going backwards and forwards before you get out of the height creation stage. But I can start diving in now to the actual Substance. So yeah, I knew I wanted this horizontal, this diagonal detail, and started with a shape node. It's pretty much one of the best nodes to define the initial shape of something, and there's a lot of control there, a lot of different shapes, and I bevel it to get some sort of edge, I suppose, some edge width on that, and I use histogram select to basically just select the values between white and black, because I want these 2 bands basically, and I want to control over how thick they were, so I can just change the bevel property, and then that will extend the width of these 2 bands. I subtract them from a square, which gives me the general shape. This node here uses the cropping functionality over here to just get rid of this the tiny little triangle. I then bevel it to get some curved edges. Classic sort of staple of sci-fi paneling is you kind of have these soft edges. You want this rounded detail. You don't want like super sharp things, and you want something to be able to like transition. So I scan it to reduce the contrast between the bevel. This is something I just do because the default bevel can sometimes have like where the bevel starts and where the bevel ends can sometimes have a little bit of like discrepancy, some sort of like errors maybe. Whereas if you just scan it and get rid of the top and bottom of the black and white detail, it just clears that right up. I invert it just so that it's the right black is low and white is high, and then I use the curve node, which is one of the most awesome newer nodes in Substance. And you can see this profile here that I've created is pretty much this profile here. So maybe if I increase the scale a little bit, you might be able to see it a little bit more, maybe on top. So you can see, yeah, this profile here.
Oh yeah,
is the same. Is the exact same profile. It even looks the same. You can see it very easily. So it's 1-to-1, and it's if it wasn't inverted first, this would be upside down, and it'd just kind of be harder to visualize what you're actually doing because you're doing the opposite of what you want. So then I reduce the range because I want to darken the shape below, which is this basic, beveled panel. Done the same thing with scan, and I've used curve here to get a nice soft top edge, and then it just sharpens up this. I think this is getting this tiny little ridge here, basically, something like that. Yeah, so I use the range node because that gives you a lot of control of basically like the height of your information and the overall height of the sort of the distance between the highest and lowest point of the detail you're bringing in, and that node is really invaluable for moving detail up and down, sort of like the depth direction of your substance. So I darken it here, and the range means that I'm using the full range of the material, of the texture, but then I'm pushing it up basically, so it's just sitting 0.1 below below white, this detail here. So that gives you a very shallow depth. So yeah, I did that for the first shape, and I don't think I did this second. I think I actually moved forward, and maybe I even had this this thing over here as well, and I didn't have this handle. But that's the beauty of Substance. You can go back and add some components in. I was like, oh, I'm going to have a handle, so I'll go back and then I'll create this new section over here. So this is just a gradient, rotated gradient, and yep, I've scanned that to get me a black and white mask. Subtracted that from a square. Use the cropping functionality again to cut the top off of this. Bevel. I think I bevel it a tiny amount there, just to get some. It's like incredibly soft edges on like there's literally 1 pixel, and that just gives you a little bit more softness. But then bevel it, scan it again, and maybe some of these nodes feel like they're doing the same thing, but it's kind of how it is with Substance. You just burn through using nodes, and maybe you go back and make it more optimal later. And then I wanted some gradient in the depth of this. I wanted it to be like a little handle where it's not all the same depth. So I use this gradient, add a curve to it to sort of this point here defines this, I think. And then I transform it into position, and then darken, which is just reducing it down. Then I use that shape to cut away from this handle shape. So that's the same process there, pretty much. This curve as well is creating, because this ultimately gets subtracted from, and then this gets subtracted from here. So this shape is, once again, is actually inverted. So I'm actually doing it the other way around this time. You can kind of do what you want. The range there again is reducing the range down. I'm subtracting it this time because this detail doesn't have, this shape doesn't have any complex detail within this shape here. Then subtract works fine. If you wanted to have the detail intersect better, if you had more complex detail here, you would use darken, because then you wouldn't get this overlaying effect. But subtract works fine in this instance. Then I use the transform node here to position it into place. and then finally subtract it to get the panel.
Wow.
And then,
So, Chris, yeah, sorry, Chris, I'll just inject a few questions here from the stream. Yeah. So, one person was asking here, a lot of these nodes you're using, are these all that ship with Substance Designer, or do you rely on any, like, I guess, I don't know, outside nodes?
I think so far these are all from Designer, unless I'm mistaken. I do think these are all so far from Designer, but I do use other nodes. I mean, I tend to. I mean, for this release as well, I tried to use fewer nodes maybe that I would have normally used that are like out there. Just because there's so many different nodes from so many different places, it becomes a little bit difficult maybe to understand if you can or can't use it maybe in certain content. I don't know. So
yeah,
I just wanted to make sure that it's mainly the stuff that's available. I do use there's like one node that, like, if anyone who knows me, like other texture artists or people that I work with, I use one node, and I'm sure I'm going to use it at some point in this graph. It'd be crazy if I didn't. So let me just try and find it. There we go. So like I have these 3 nodes. This one's it's multi-directional warp nearest neighbor. So, but I have a multi-directional warp as well, which is the grayscale version, and a colored multi-directional warp. There you go. So there's the regular one. So this one has pixel blending at the end, so the results will get interpolated. This one keeps everything pixel perfect, which is great for modifying masks. And there's a colored version of this as well that do color data, but I very rarely use that one actually. But these are all created from a tutorial that Vincent Go did. So one of your guys, awesome dude, and I basically followed his tutorial that was on YouTube, and then made my own nodes, and I just made this. Modified it and made this nearest neighbor one as well, because I realized I wanted that functionality.
Oh yeah, see, Vincent's working our chat. So hey, Vincent, if you can, if you have it, post a link to that tutorial.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Yeah, because it doesn't get enough recognition. I mean, I literally use it, like, in every single graph I do. It's so useful. I've just come to Naughty Dog, and I've sort of brought it with me. Like I use that at work as well. So it's awesome.
Yeah. So one other one, Chris, and then we'll kind of get you back into the swing of the graph there. So another person was asking, how are you controlling the height maps and the blending? Like basically talking about controlling the overlap that's occurring. And I think maybe you've touched on that some with what you're doing with the different blending modes.
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. I mean, it's basically like, subtract it. Like it's like 4 blending modes pretty much that you use. You use lighten, lighten, which is like max, and then min, darken, and add and subtract. You pretty much only use those to blend height information together. It's like at least with hard surface detail, because everything else is going to give you a sort of weird result. With with natural materials, you're definitely going to be able to play around with all what Substance has to offer, like soft light and an overlay. They'll give you a completely different result. But for hard surface stuff, I would say that darken and lighten, which I haven't used lighten yet, I don't think. Maybe I have, but they're almost like Boolean subtraction and addition from, like, regular modeling software, or it feels very much like that in 2D. So I've been an environment artist for most of my career. Like the first 10 years of my career is an environment artist. So modeling was always like the biggest part of my job. But in the last 2 years, I've been professionally a texture artist. So transitioning that workflow has always been something like I want to be able to visualize it in 3D, and this is why the 3D view and tessellation is great, because you can see that. And so let me just try and modify something here, maybe see what that does to the effect. So the range. So like if I change the range on this panel detail and make it higher up, it's basically going to just bring it out of the surface. So it's like almost like the detail is still there, but I moved it up. I moved the object up that's cutting away in a way. And the further down you go, it's going to subtract deeper. And yeah, like darken will do that the best, because what darken's going to do is, if it interacts with any other shape, which sadly in this instance it's not really doing, but maybe I could change something. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it would be beneficial to do that, but basically, if you cut some shape in and you have some other hole there, it's not gonna like double cut into that hole as well. It's gonna act like in real life. If you cut detail away, the detail that's already there is going to be there, and it's going to be there at the same height that it was, except in the areas that you're cutting away, and the depth's going to be sort of relative. So yeah, darken, lighten, add and subtract are your mainstay for doing like hard surface and most other height detail cutting away and adding. Let's put this back to 0.9. Where was that? And yeah, the blend node is basically how you do all that. I do sometimes, you may see areas. I mean, this might be an area here where I have a mask, which I think this is, yeah, I sometimes use masks to prevent the detail you're cutting away at other things that you know outside of the area you want to work in. And this happens more and more as you get smaller and smaller details. You might only want to affect this area here, but you're starting to affect something here when you use this technique of changing the range. You might start cutting away at everything. So you can use a mask to just prevent that from happening sometimes, as I am doing here with this mask is preventing this detail, because this is gray. So if I didn't have this mask, it would reduce the overall height of every single thing in the graph. So maybe if I disconnect that, you will see, yeah. So it's darkening, lightening up to this level, which is this gray value. So it's ruining everything below that I don't want to work on. So I have this mask here made from the height detail itself, which just stops it from doing that. And that's kind of everything. It's just the same thing repeated over and over again. So yeah, I can move back onto the graph now. So let me just see if there's any. So yeah, this one here is like I'm making some slots for putting screws in. So when I created these two, I probably created them at the same time, but broke them off because. So initially, I probably made like, I'm going to make some screws, and I subtracted them. But I knew that I always wanted two together, because it's like it's the same everywhere. I always want two. So okay, rather than keep positioning them together every single time, I'll make an object which is. I can just do open reference. I can just make those screws. Actually, I won't view that in 3D, but I can make those screws as a separate object. So this bolt is this, and then this gets brought into this graph, and then this is what it is here. So, and I just transform it into position, and then I use the cropping functionality again to crop only these two. And this is actually something extra that isn't getting used in this graph yet. There may be some control for it, maybe that I added. No, maybe there isn't. No, there isn't actually. So maybe I think that's actually just redundant. But so let's go to the bolt. So yeah, the bolt that I use throughout the graph there is the polygon node. Really good for screw heads. Obviously, it's perfect for that kind of thing. Do the same thing with the scan. I actually use scan to give it a flat top, because otherwise it would just have a flat top. I think you can kind of do that in here, but I just did it in scan because I'm used to doing that. I inverted it, changed the range, and once again darkened. So I think you're not. It's a very tiny detail in the overall graph, but if you probably change this to multiply, it might look a little bit different. Yeah, I mean it's a much of a muchness, but it does blend in a different way, and I definitely use darken more than multiply.
Yeah, it's definitely really awesome to use Substance Designer this way, almost like a modeling tool. Like
Yeah,
myself, having a modeling background, this is kind of the way I like to work as well, where it's you can bring these modeling mindsets and do this right here inside Designer, and I've always found that to be one of my favorite aspects of the tool.
yeah, no, it's perfect for me, and I think it's a lot of people, because Substance Design is still, I suppose it's standard now, but it was, and it still is, I suppose, like a new way for a lot of people to work in terms of nodes. Modeling in 3D is kind of like, I suppose, more like real life. You kind of you're moving shapes around in a 3D space, and so it makes a little bit more sense out of the gate. But it does actually transition really well over to this, as long as you understand the blend modes. It does transition really well, and you can start to think about things in 3D. And it also helps, it helps people who are moving over maybe from like a traditional ZBrush sculpt and bake workflow to this. And also, if because you can totally combine the the systems there. You can totally make details in ZBrush and then bake them out as height maps and bring that content into here, and you're going to still kind of work in the same kind of way that you were before. So it sort of makes the transition a little bit easier thinking in this way.
Yeah, I'm also finding it to be a lot like working in Houdini. Like if you're doing any procedural modeling there, it's like pretty much the same workflow except for textures. So it's like, as Houdini is to modeling, it's Designer for textures. Is that kind of the same approach, where you're procedurally building up these shapes. And like you said, using different blend modes to kind of, have that kind of Boolean modeling workflow still.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Yeah, and in the same way as well. Like like I started off with a bigger shape and moved into a smaller shape. Obviously, I'm nowhere near the end of the main graph yet, but that transitions across where you start with a bigger shape and you sort of cut away at that shape with finer and finer detail. You don't want to start doing these sort of indentations and scratches and things. You don't want to start doing that straight away because you have nothing to cut away at, and that's exactly how it would be in 3D in Maya or ZBrush. You wouldn't do that pass at the start. You do that at the end. So there's a lot of similarities once you get your mind around the 2D sort of work plane, I suppose. But for me, it's perfect, and I enjoy it. I enjoy it very much so. So I'm going to move back to the main graph now. I have the like auto compute off, so I always have to click that. I just prefer it because then graphs open up a little bit quicker. Okay, so I made these separate, but I basically, once I realized that I actually wanted the screws to be sort of adding to the surface, but adding to an indentation, then I made this second sort of section, which is just basically a shape that encompasses, you can see that these encompass the same area. One of them's a bit lower res, but so that cuts in first. I use the same sort of transforms to get them into the same place. Using the range node as well there to decide the height. And so yeah, that's pretty much, if you do all those things, these get added on a little bit later just because some other stuff's happening, but that's pretty much the individual panel that gets made. And then there's the hinge, the edge that gets added on here. And so that's done using this long thin thing. I think that is this. I think that is, it's this long thin detail. So it actually it is just it's a square. It's a really thin square shape. The shape tool is super awesome for hard surface detail like this, because you're just creating your sort of Boolean components that you're adding and subtracting. And then I bevel it to get these nice soft edges again. I believe I scan it again to flatten the top, give the top also a curved edge, change the range, and move that into position. That subtracts, so because there's no detail underneath, I can subtract very easily, and I don't need to use darken because there's no detail underneath there that's going to get in the way of that, so it's fine. And then this is to create the I think it's to create this little rod. Let's just see, actually. Yeah, this creates the sort of rod that I suppose is holding the door in place. So yeah, for this one, because I didn't need any curvature on the top, because actually it's going to be hidden under this block detail here. I just did a directional blur. I don't really care about what's happening up here. It's going to get hidden anyway, so I can just use this. It's a little bit cheaper, I think, than some of the other blurs, but it doesn't really matter. You could use whatever you wanted to. But transform into position. By default, this directional blur will always give you kind of, a perfect pyramid sort of shape, a pointy shape. And so to get that to be more like a cylinder that's been laid down on a surface, I use curve node, and this is literally like 2 points, and then this point up here is the handle has been taken all the way over here. So it creates a perfect quarter circle shape. And doing that will give you a nice curved surface. This is just directional blur again, and then this is a perfect example of like cutting away at that shape. So this uses darken as always, and it's cutting down into that shape there. You can see it. So, but if I used multiply, it gives you a weird edge, because it's like double, like it's multiplying the lower values at a different rate that it's doing to the higher values. So you get a weird, it doesn't make sense, I suppose, in 3D. This shape is like, it's confusing. But with darken, it's just like you're just literally cutting away with like a knife almost at the angle that this would be, an angle, a sort of, what is it? Diagonal angle through the surface. The range has changed a little bit. And then I lighten. This is a good example of using the lighten blend mode rather than something else. Is lighten is going to combine the two surfaces and only give you the lightest pixel, which is, that sounds all good and well, but like what it means is you can control just at which point they sort of blend in like height. You're not adding one on top of another, or you're not adding one, multiplying them together. That their shapes are not going to change each other's shape. They're just going to be sort of sat next to each other in 3D space, I suppose. So by changing this histogram range value, you'll see that actually I can move this rod higher and lower relative to this shape here. So if I move it down, you'll see that it gets lower down, and you can see if I eventually, it's going to get up to the top of the range of the texture, and it actually kind of breaks after like 0.5, because that's just kind of how, like this is already at the max height, so because it's white, so this can't go higher. Clearly, it would probably be easier to show, by if I added a range node here and set the range to full, and so I'm going to view this one. You can see by pulling that down, the other one eventually pops out at the top, and so they're not changing each other's shape; they're just relative in height. But yeah, obviously I don't want that, so I'm going to delete that node.
So Chris, just a few more questions coming in as you're going through things. So one question here: how did you manage to not have stretched texture with your height map on border of extruded surface?
I was trying to figure out. Oh, right, I get that. Yeah, so it's like, I think it means like sort of these edges here, how like they're not stretched. I mean, they are stretched at the edge, because you're always going to get that with any height information. But what you tend to do as a way of working is I always try to make sure that every feature that I have, and I think that's why in this here. Yeah, so like every feature that you build, in real life, this shape actually might be this, and it has a vertical drop at the edge of it, but that's going to create a lot more stretching than what I had before. So you always want like a little bit of a bevel or a little bit of gradation, like at the edges of surfaces that may in reality be vertical, and you wouldn't see them from above. you want to have this faked kind of like edge to them, so that you'll get less stretching the more this is like over here. So this is stretched less now. It's a different shape, but there's less stretching. So you kind of want to add safeguards in to prevent that as much as you can. You're probably going to get that a little bit anyway, and the more like you can see more stretching here because this is higher up than this, and this is a curved surface, so you're not seeing as much stretching. You see a little bit here, but generally you just keep you want to watch it based on what your actual overall height is that you want to have on your surface. So that's kind of the height that I ultimately want to go for. If it looks kind of okay from this angle, and it's fine.
And Chris, you're currently in the material settings, and you're adjusting your height scale. Like, when you're starting material like this, like, how do you come up with what value you're going to use for that height? Like, you have 0.97 there. How do you know what that is?
I mean, that's the thing. Like, you don't really come up with a height value because this is just a scale value of, I suppose, effectively of like, it depends on the scale of the model that you have in. So if you have a cube here, it's just gonna extrude it. This value will be a certain amount relative to the distance between black and white. So if if at the end of the texture here I had my height detail, so my height detail is that's not my height. Roughness, height. So yeah, this height detail here is it's actually not like auto levels or anything at the end. The range has actually been changed. I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but oh yeah, that's some of the controls that Allegorithmic have at the end, so for the tools and tweaking things. But basically, as long as you have your height, you don't want your entire range of your height map to be between like 0 and 0.1. That'll give you a very like low range height map, and you'll have to have the extrusion, the height value super high in your material. But really, the value is entirely dependent upon the sort of relative distance between the lowest point in your height map and the highest point. Like in real life, I suppose. If you have a texture like this, that in real life, the distance between here and here might be 5 centimeters. But if you have a huge rocky surface, the distance between the height of the outmost piece and the innermost piece might be 50 centimeters, and in which case that value is going to be completely different. So there's really no perfect value, and you should just change that value based on what you want to get what looks right here, because it's decoupled from the normal map anyway. It's only a visual thing. The range that you want to care more about the relative heights of things in your graph. So you want to make sure that the thing that you want higher up is higher up than the thing than other detail, but the actual distance between them is kind of relative to that slider that we played with. So it's not something to worry about. I don't ever care what the height value of that slider is. It's just something you play around with. And if you were using this in a video game, those values are set in the shader, I suppose. So they can be set individually, and you don't need to worry about like having that embedded in your texture usually. So it's kind of fine, and it's not something to worry about.
Okay, great. Just another question here was, how do you fake shadow under the rivets?
So I think I'm not really faking shadow. I'm just using some. I mean, you could do some faking of some shadows if these were like higher up and there was actually supposed to be a gap between this surface and this surface. But I mean, they probably wouldn't be in real life. But I think Daniel Tiger he did something on like adding like a second pass of AO for his grass that he wants to have higher up than maybe the graph would normally do. So you can have like a second pass of AO. So maybe I would just take the height map, like mask off these parts, and you can do a separate AO pass on that maybe. But I don't think I've really done that I think I've maybe done that in one graph in in this pack, if at all. So I tend to just let the height map do what it does. And maybe with grass, like in Daniel Tiga's work, like, that is a good situation where you might want to do that. But in the materials that I generally make, I just let everything kind of speak for itself right at the end. You can see that the last node in the height map literally goes into the AO, into the normal, and into the height. So everything is done in one pass, one height map, and then comes out at the end. And the nodes within Substance Designer take care of all the results of that, and they always give a good result. So yeah, there is no like extra AO. It's a lot of it's actually dirt, I think, from later in the graph. Okay, so I'll move back on to some of this stuff. So I mean, it's kind of the same thing over and over again. I mean, that's how it ends up being with with these kind of materials, because they're hard surface and you're effectively modeling. So each stage is a modeling stage, which just like in real life, modeling something is using the same tools over and over again to just define different shapes. But after I've created this panel and I've added these on, which is all here, and the hinge has been added, which is this shape here, then I have this final shape. So I think I scale it up a little bit because I wanted it to just move it around in relation to this. There's probably something I did later, but so that's what that node does. And then I use save transform tile 2 to get the nodes. To get the storage unit covers to be 2 by 2. This is the stage where I add the bolts in, actually. So I add them in here because of I'm not sure why. I can't remember why it's done here. That tends to happen sometimes in graphs. You can't remember why exactly you did something at the time, but
yeah, happens to all of us.
Yeah, but and then I mirror it because I think originally I had all the panels were actually facing the same way, and then I realized I actually want it to be symmetrical down the middle. This sort of almost like chevron shape feels a little bit more sci-fi, and I kind of like that a bit better. I like having these all in the center, so they can have one thing that's sitting on top, which I get to make here. So this is the little hinge block that I made that covers those. This is a separate graph as well, so I can pin this graph and open this one. I'll open it in a second one. So I believe I just made this. I pretty much just made this shape in a separate graph and then brought it in, and I did some tweaking. I have the two graphs loaded like this, so you can tweak it. You can also just sometimes I just make things in this graph, but then I want to separate them off just because I want to work on them by themselves, or maybe you want to work like I didn't know at the time, but I only actually used the node once in the graph anyway, so maybe you don't need it to be in a separate graph, but it's sometimes nicer anyway just to have things separated off. And that is the same kind of system over and over again. I definitely started off with I suppose that's like, if I move this out of the way, I probably started off with this. The shape just defines the overall shape and a little bevel on the top. I think that's this little bevel here is what we've been talking about before, where you want some kind of transition on the edge that you're going to use. Obviously, that's probably the area in the graph that has in the material that has the most stretching, but it's not. It's still not. Oh, let's get rid of this. It's not that. It's not that big a deal, really. And then this shape, which is just a. That's actually not doing anything much, but. So yeah, the directional blur again to get bevels on the side. Use the curve to make it a curved shape. So I get this nice curved surface, and then I subtract from the top and bottom to get this beveled surface here. And then I want this detail. So I probably started with like this, and I was like, okay, I want to cut like a lozenge shape, a capsule, sorry. And then I cut that in probably like this. And I was like, okay, yeah, I like that, but maybe I want some sort of like hydraulic kind of detail in there. So maybe I'll just I'll add this on top of that. And I'll darken again, which cuts in. This is a really good example, actually, of like how darken will give you a completely different result to multiply. It's like just night and day, the difference. One of them is like it's so hard to visualize what this shape is, and it gives you a really weird blended ghosting. But with darken, those two shapes are going to stay intact and they're going to merge together. So it's really really obvious there, the difference. And so yeah, I subtract that shape from this shape, and then I already created the bolts from before, so I just add them in on the corners. And then that's just the only output of these graphs is a height map. So I use that in the main graph over here. So yes, so I think I'm doing a little bit. Oh yeah, I have these little background plates. Pretty simple. I mean, like everything starts with the shape node. If you've noticed, everything's pretty much a shape, beveled and scanned or modified in some slight way. The range maybe, some sort of positioning type node. So there's usually like I position things, which is kind of what this is doing. It's not a transform node, but this tile generator positions them. And then I change the range. That's kind of like, create your mask, bevel to get some height and edge definition. Maybe some processing, scan just to get the right range for the details within this section, and then positioning, and then an overall range node to set it up for when you're going to blend it. And so that's pretty much all that height information done. And I blend them together again with lighten, so that these shapes intersect correctly with the shape. And I add the hinge block on there with lighten as well. That's kind of the same system. Let's see what this is. So this is like this weird tube. I use this bolt here, and this is actually the same thing, just different size, and I just transform them at different scales. So let's just see. I create a gradient, scan that. That gets me a sharp tube, I suppose. Let's just see what that looks like without the curve node. Yeah, so it's completely not what you want there. I mean, it's kind of interesting shape, actually. Maybe that's kind of sci-fi in a different way, but I wanted it to be very sort of retro tubes. So added that curve node on, some stripes, rotated them, subtract. So in this instance, subtract works better because it's going to add relative height across the model, whereas if I had it's not going to work so much in this instance, but like darken, it's going to give you a weird thing. But subtract, I think I cut the ends off with the clipping. I subtract these. I subtract these ends off, which is just a stripe with an edge and a curve that I just create this sort of more interesting edge detail that cuts this shape here. I use that to darken, add some more bolts on, transform them into position, transform them again vertically so that they overlap over the edge, and then change the range, and then lighten them back on to add them. I'm going to move away from this. Is all the same thing as well, so I'm going to move away from this. This is just this detail back here, and it's very simple. It's kind of the same stuff. Beveling a shape, transforming, some masking maybe, and then just change the range and add it in. But yeah, I'm going to move on to maybe some of the height detail now, because obviously it's taking, maybe I'm going a bit slower maybe than is required. But
Chris, another question real quick. So someone was asking, what size is this wall material?
I suppose in real life, I suppose it's supposed to be like, maybe these are 1 meter across, each panel, so 2 meters by 2 meters, and the graph I tend to work at 2048 by 2048. So yeah, maybe in game as well. Like what I tend to do is work at double the resolution that my intended texture will be at. So yeah, I always work in, if I'm going to make a 1024, I tend to work at 2048, and then I downsample it. Not in the graph. I usually do it afterwards. Like if it's going to go into an engine, maybe sometimes I don't downsample at all, but sometimes if I have to, if I'm doing it for a video game or something, then you obviously texture memory is important, and you can half the resolution down to 1024, and you're going to get a little bit more anti-aliasing on the edge if you do that, because obviously everything in Substance is kind of generated at resolution that you work at. But if you then downsample half res, you're going to get like a really nice anti-aliased edge on every single pixel, and it's going to look a lot smoother. So I tend to do that, and I think that's kind of in a lot of studios, that's kind of a lot of situations, that's kind of common practice to work at twice resolution that you intend to end up at. Yeah. So yeah, the height is basically finished for the overall shape, and I move on to damaging the surface now, which is a very subtle stage, and you use very low values to do this. So I mean, the opacity of this actually, because yeah, a lot of this is controlled by the age slider. Let's see. So I have age here, which is a value that controls multiple parameters, usually linear interpolating between one value and the next. So like something being clean and something, or something being clean and damaged, or something being less opaque and something being more opaque. So as this value gets increased and the age gets older, basically these nodes have more of an effect. That's kind of all that's happening in different stages. So for the micro damage, which I think is, this stuff, I start off with black and white spots, which has too much information in it. I use black and white spots 2 rather than black and white spots 1, just because the scale is sort of softer on this one, and this one's very like just the scale is just generally better for the texture that I'm making. And I tend to use this one more anyway because it has a little bit more detail going on. I height pass that to get rid of. There's like too much height range between each area of detail, so I want a more even, flat distribution of details, and so height pass will basically do that. It'll bring the relative ranges of each area of your texture together, and get rid of the low frequency detail like this. You're getting rid of this weird sort of cloudy effect and just getting the smaller details. Then I scan that to basically isolate only a few parts of it, because I don't want too many scratches or too many bits of damage. I use that as a mask on a non-uniform blur node, because that will it's kind of like a better way maybe to do damage, I think, because you won't get a lot of damage on areas that, I don't know, it's like edge damage in a way. So if you have if you subtracted this normally, which this is doing darkening here, if you just subtracted it, you would get damage everywhere, and it would be evenly just like spread everywhere, whereas non-uniform blur is going to only blur the areas that this mask has, and then if you use that result to darken the height map that you sort of started out with, then it's only really going to affect these areas here, the edge, where there's some sort of transition in height detail. So you can see it's appearing, it's not really appearing on the flat surfaces because there's no detail to blur away and give you a result. So like if I make this crazy, it's going to break it, but the bigger I get, the more it's going to distribute on sort of flat surfaces. So yeah, and eventually you can see here, like this one's a really good. It's like blurring out. It's like like cutting away at the surface, and all it's doing is just bringing more and more detail in from the blurred areas. It's a sort of cheap way, I suppose, cheap and quick way to do damage. So I do that. I do the same technique with scratches, exactly the same technique, but I obviously start with some scratches, and I start off with, because this node's quite expensive, I start off with like few scratches in here, and then instead of having just a crazy amount of scratches in this node and maybe using multiple ones of them, I actually just like save transform that node and add it back together and tile it at different rates, and eventually, you end up with a really complicated. You can't really see it because they're at such low values, but there's like tiny little details in here, and they all blur and get added to the end. And then there's a little bit of, actually, no, that's actually the detail. Sorry, the detail is very simple in this one. That's basically all the surface detail. And then there's some scratch paint that happens. So yeah, I start off with moisture noise, which is a really good node for getting to some sort of dirty detail. I use quantize, which then breaks everything out into just solid blocks of color with no blending. And this is where I use that multi-directional warp nearest neighbor to push things around. Basically, I'm using this to push itself around, and this is also controlling the direction in which it moves around. So you can you can see that it's just breaking up that detail, so that you can end up with some very complex detail that's like super interesting and might take you a lot more nodes to make if you didn't use this node. So, but these nodes are, because they're embedded in this file, they'll be available obviously on as the dependencies with this file if you check it out on source. So I use that to just blend using copy over ambient occlusion. Yeah, so I take the height map that I already have and I invert it, which is giving me obviously the crevices are now outcrops, I suppose. I then blend that with the quantized moisture noise. I add in this damage mask, which is, let's see what this is. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of how I blend some details together. Is if you take a height map and then you do something to that height map, and then divide it by itself before you did anything to it. So like this is the height map with no scratches, this is the height map with scratches, and you divide those two together. And I'm doing the same here with the height map with no micro damage and the height map with micro damage. I'm dividing them here, and then I'm just multiplying them together to combine them. If you then scan that with an incredibly low value, you basically get a mask of just where the details have affected your model between those two stages. So I get a mask of where all the damage is happening. So you can see that here, and then I'm adding that back on to the scratch paint. So I'm multiplying that to make sure that the damage of those two stages affects the sort of peeling of the paint, which I can maybe show by tweaking the age slider. Yeah, so it's quite a subtle. It sort of goes at the end a lot. You can see it on the edges, like the paint is scratching a lot more as the age gets towards 1. That just means that those details are going to get brought into this this slider. So I can bring that back down. Yes. So.
So Chris, another question for you here. So someone was talking about you can create a plane and it takes only 1 polygon, low memory, but how much of this kind of texture takes for a game engine? I guess they're kind of asking this could be just 1 displaced polygon, but how much impact does that have in game, I guess?
I mean, 1 texture is not going to be a lot. I mean, these days you don't really have I mean, you're having more and more tessellation in video games, and I'm sure in the future that's going to be, in 10 years, that's going to be, everything's going to have some sort of tessellation displacement on it. So I'm sort of future-proofing maybe my work by doing this kind of now, or maybe anybody is who works with height information in Substance Designer. But In a game, maybe I would say 9 times out of 10, this is just going to be a normal map. So it's actually going to be flat, and you're just going to have the normal detail rather than the height detail. But maybe you'll have parallax mapping, which is a sort of the illusion of height, which you would get by using the parallax occlusion version of the shader, which doesn't have the height map information. So you can see it, but it's a visual effect. Obviously, it's not real height, and it doesn't have any silhouette on the edge. So in a video game, I would say you would have more of that than actual displaced detail. But I create them and obviously present them with 3D detail on, because I suppose that's the best way you can present the texture. And it really depends, the complexity and how expensive it is in a video game is going to be down to the number of different textures you have. So if you're going to have, so this texture has, I'm just going to move back to the tessellation material because I prefer it. But this material has a metalness map in it. And plenty of materials don't. Plenty of, like if you have rocks, it's probably not going to have a metalness map unless there's some sort of like, rocks with pieces of gold, veins running through them, and so that's an entire texture that you're not going to have if you don't have metalness. So, or maybe if you have a flat texture, like let's say like a skimmed concrete wall, then you're probably not even going to really want to have parallax mapping or displacement on it. So you won't, even though you have this height map output here, and that turns to a normal map, you're probably not going to use this height map in the actual game. So you're saving a texture there. So really, it's all about the number of textures you're going to have and the size of them. So, you tend to want to like optimize where you can if you don't need a texture. And that's only if you're going to throw loads of textures at your game. If your game has very few textures in, or you have if your world is built, it's all in a dungeon, and the whole dungeon is made with the same rocks and the same dirt and things, then you can play around a little bit more with having bigger textures, maybe because you have fewer of them. But in AAA video games, like memory is a really big thing, and you have to kind of make sure that you optimize your texture as much as possible. Use as many techniques as you can to minimize the number of texture samples and the number of blends maybe you have in a material. But it's not a defined value, and it depending on which engine you use to even run it in, it's going to have a different cost. And some engines are better at having more textures. Some engines are better with like polygons. Some, depending on the type of lighting you're using, you may be spending memory on light maps, but you may not be. You may be doing it real time. So there's a lot to consider. But the texture artist doesn't need to worry so much in the creation stage. It's more in the how getting it into game. Yeah. Okay, so that's the damage pretty much done. I mean, I'm blending it in. I'm literally just blending it all together basically and contrasting it and using ambient occlusion to mask some details and just getting this overall mask of random details, like scratches gets added in. I subtract from the bolts there in this mask. This is like the scratch paint mask, and I add because these bolts are supposed to be metal, so they're effectively always scratched because they always want to be metal. So like adding that on there is just going to override the fact that I never want them to have paint on them. And then this final scan is just the contrast of that overall mask, and this position parameter here is controlled in the graph, and moving that up and down is going to give you a more or less scratch surface. Yeah. So then once I've done my height, I basically move on to my color. Some people do the roughness next. I know like Josh Lynch, which he's been featured by Allegorithmic a few times, I'm sure, I think in the past. And he does his roughness second, but I do my I always do my color. It's personal preference, but as you can see, the color stage of this graph, the color part is actually really simple, and all it does is use things I've already created as masks to generate the separation between color. So, I mean, I have a little bit of text here, which just comes from the text node, and I just transform that into position and then blend. I have a text color, which is parameterized there, and the same with the door color. I just blend between those. So it's very simple stuff. And this text node is really useful. It's a pretty new node in Substance. It's very useful for adding that. Normally, before you would have to always bring in a texture to do that kind of thing. But now you can do it right in the graph. And so, yeah, as I move forward, I just sample areas of the graph. And my technique, you can use the height. There's like a height blend node, and there's there's many other ways to blend in detail. But I have this sort of technique that I've been using since I started, which just, I don't know, it still works for me, so I use it. Which is I take the detail that I want to mask out. I take the final result of that detail having been added with everything else. So that's you're getting this node here and this node here. And much like I did the scratches down here, where I did this dividing technique here to get a mask, I do the same thing here. So I divide them together and then run a scan node, and that just gives me a really sharp pixel mask between the what here is the background plates and everything else. So then I can make them white. Then I do the same thing again with the hinge, which is literally it's having such a small effect, but you can see that I'm just doing it there to give control to that, and you can change so you can see that that's changing that area there. Same thing with this black plastic. That's just using the same technique. Again, I'm blending in a lot of uniform colors here, and I know that a lot of people, me included, use gradient maps to sort of make this a little bit more complicated and have a lot more detail in there. What I tend to do is when I'm making a graph, I'll just use a uniform color to begin with, and then keep moving down the graph, pushing forward through the texture. And then if I think that, well, maybe that area, maybe these background tiles are a little bit simple and they need more detail, then I might go back in here and I'll be like, okay, I kind of want it to be this color, or I want it to, I'll expand this. I'm going to add some more stuff in here. I'm going to add, some moisture noise maybe, and then a gradient map. Use the gradient map to sample some colors or pick some colors. Either one is fine. And blend multiple things together to get something like this, but that has more detail. This is 16 by 16 pixels just because it's the most optimum. But I would blend in something more complex maybe if this wasn't enough. But I want to keep it as simple as possible. So it was enough basically to have just a solid color for that. This paint discoloration just adds some grunge, and this grunge is just warped by itself with this node as well, which just tweaks the result a little bit, makes it a little bit different. And that I use a hue saturation node to desaturate and lower the brightness, and then I just blend that with itself. So all this is doing is just modifying the surface a little bit. Blend in the scratches, and the scratches weren't blended with the way that I did the other stuff, so I can actually just use the scratches as the actual mask and just contrast that. And I just make them darker. Scratch 2 is the same, but I make them lighter. I'm using a lighter color. Metal color, so metal is usually just a very desaturated. If it's not gold, it's some strange metal. It's always going to be sort of grayish, and that's just made from clouds. I quantize that, warp that around as well, using that node as well, and do it again because that makes it even more complicated. You could keep doing this, and it would keep getting more granular. Save transform, which just adds, if you rotate it by more than 45 but less than 90, it's going to just rotate it 45. I blend that with some multi-directional warp with, what's that? So it's the same. I use the previous things that I've used just to save on, expense. All I want is some random detail, and I just have, I'm just using two things I already made and make some weird detail. Combine that with, the transformed detail. This is supposed to be like a little bit like flaky. What is it like? There's a word for it, but it's like a certain type of metal surface. It's like it has a weird finish basically, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's
Is it like galvanized?
Yeah, galvanized. I think that's
Yeah.
it. Yeah. So it has a weird flaky sort of look to it. I'm just adding a little bit of that in there. I do a gradient map just to get some color, but I end up pretty much getting rid of like 90% of that. There's a little bit of brown left in. And I think this just slightly changes the color on some of the edges of things. Using, I think it's just like inverse AO, I think, and it's scanned, yeah. So then I blend that with a paint scratch mask that's already from before, which then means that wherever the paint gets scratched, I'm going to add this metal color in. This scratch mask is also then used for the metallic output as well, because it's pretty much a mask. And I add some dust over everything at the end, just two different passes of different colored dust. So you'll see that like it's very subtle, but like some sort of dust on the edges. And I tend to use the ambient occlusion, either with an inverted input or a normal one, if you want it in the cracks or in like on the extremities of the surface, and just blend it with some moisture noise to get a little bit of variation. Do that twice, different colors. You'll see the dark stuff coming in, the darker dust. Yeah, you can see there. This is the mask. And yeah, that's kind of the color. Really, it's very simple. I mean, I wanted to keep the materials like as simple as possible because depending on how long you spend on it, you could go crazy and keep going forever and maybe like adding in like, oh, I'm going to add in paint splatter. I'm going to add there's so much more you can add. Oh, I also add this sticky grunge, which is like, yeah, you can see it here. It's like sort of like dripping kind of detail, like something has been sort of like dripped on it and smeared down, and that's just some grunge. And I use the levels node to hide, to mask out most of the detail because you don't want just this big complex map that's going to affect everything. A non-uniform blur is really awesome if you use the same texture but inverted as the input. Then you can have it blur in one direction, and that's really awesome for like dripping things. I think I blur it and just add it with itself, as well as some noise, some level adjustments. I think I sharpen at the end just because it like really brings out some of the details that might have been a little bit lost, and then I blend that on at the end, so you can see the difference between without it and with this. Oh, no, that's not what I meant to do. There, so you can see the difference there. This last little node here just like enhances. I don't know. It's like sometimes at the end you find that like things just, and this can depend on which engine you're using as well to show things in, depending on how your lighting is working. If you're using real time or baked lighting, but sometimes you just want a little bit of extra detail and a very subtle amount just to pick out the details in the texture. So you can see it's very subtle, but it sort of picks out a little bit of the detail in the crevices. These nodes at the end here are all the like substance nodes for like putting things on substance source. So that this is stuff that you guys sort of gave me and like direction, and this all controls a lot of the parameters at the end of the material here. All this like channel stuff and technical parameters. These sort of top 6 are things that I've added. And yeah, the roughness is basically the same as the color. all I do is blend in solid colors using the masks I've already created, and not only that, I'm pretty much using the masks I've already used for the color. Once you've gone through this process of just defining different uniform values for things, then you want to start adding a little bit of complexity, maybe, and a little bit of AO and a little bit of detail in the crevices, and sort of like. But I always pretty much define everything with this first, so I just get this mask of different base values, and then I tweak it, with the masks that I've already made, adding and subtracting. This is me changing the roughness for the metal areas, so I'm just literally taking one of the metal masks, changing the range, and just blending that in. And then I add the dirt into the roughness on top as well, using the same masks. And that's kind of it, really. I mean, as you can see, it's a lot of the same processes over and over again. And really, once you've finished the height map and you've plugged that into AO and set the normal up, and then it sort of like cascades very quickly, and you can finish your material very fast after that point, because this whole color roughness stage is very simple and is more about just connecting nodes than sort of thinking about you're not really building your texture. You're not really being sort of creative anymore. You're more being just like, oh, I'm going to export this soon, and it very quickly gets done. It's a nice stage to go through, because you sort of relax a little bit after you've spent so long making your material. But the complexity of this stage as well depends entirely on your material. Like, if you have rock and something that's incredibly detailed, maybe, or doesn't have flat surfaces, then these stages are going to take longer, and this color stage is probably going to be more complex and use more gradient maps and more grunge and noise and height maps and things. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Well, Chris, this is it's a really fantastic example. Lots of really good techniques in here that you shared with us, and it's been awesome to be able to hang here with you and just kind of walk through this. I've learned a ton myself, just kind of watching your techniques. I also I want to be aware of your time frame, because I know you have to actually get to work this morning.
Yeah, it's okay. Well, I know that I've gone on a little bit longer, and at the end I tried to sort of like increase my speed a little bit. But
yeah, it's okay. I didn't want to interrupt you too much. I was like, but yes, I do. Yeah, be aware of your time. We have just a few other questions. We can just kind of wrap things up.
That's fine.
Q&A. So one question that's pretty good here was someone was asking about resources, tutorials, or specific kind of workflow that you would recommend for people who are starting out wanting to become a texture artist.
I mean, I would say that when I get into, like these days, Substance Designer is pretty much, I would say, like a huge part. You need to learn Substance Designer if you want to be a texture artist, at least for environment. If you're a character texture artist, it's probably going to be more Painter. But if you want to be an environment texture artist, or just a texture artist in general, and you want to present, maybe you want to put stuff on ArtStation or something, then I think Designer is going to be the way forward. And then your workflow, everybody seems to now kind of agree that this kind of like doing your height map and then turning that into a normal map, and generally getting most of your results out of that is the way to go. And then so I would just take a look at Daniel Tiga's work. He's done a lot of tutorials recently, and he has a ton of content. The guy produces stuff all the time. Josh Lynch, he does a lot of stuff, and he does tutorials and things, and you can buy them on various places, and there's plenty of free ones available as well. But I mean, the best way to do it is I would say, from my own personal experience of one day not using Substance Designer, and then a year later being like completely addicted to it and using it all the time, is just give yourself a task. Find some reference, and don't go crazy. Don't go find something that's like super complicated, like the most complicated material you can find. Find something simple like tiles, or concrete or something that's kind of a sort of beginner material, and just try and match it. And even if you fail, it's fine, because you're going to learn so much by playing around in Substance. Like it's such a creative process, and it's not some sort of structured thing where you have to do this and then you have to do this. It's I learned how to use all these nodes by literally just going down here and like, what's noises? Let's have a look at the noises, and just literally dragging them in, and then just what does this do? Oh, that does that. Okay, yeah. Just literally playing with the nodes. And if you give yourself a task, something that you want to do, and I'm going to do it by Friday, you'll probably fail. And if you're starting off, it won't look amazing, but it'll be the texture you do after that will be twice as good, and you will have learned so much by doing the first step. So I would just say play around and post your work online, get feedback from people, Polycount and ArtStation, and just keep up to date with what's happening in all these different outlets online and things. But I think you're probably going to generally want to use workflows similar to this, and what Daniel uses and what Josh uses, and there's countless other people out there that post stuff on ArtStation that you want to follow their things, really. And I think, just experimentation you will get there if you love it enough. You have to love it.
Yeah, let's see here. Another question that we had, Chris, was someone was asking about, could you explain the difference between spec gloss versus rough metal, just kind of from your own perspective? I guess they're just asking, like, what differences for you? Why are you using metal rough and so on? Well,
I mean, before PBR, things sort of were this sort of spec gloss workflow, although now the spec gloss workflow is a PBR one. So a long time ago, I was kind of used to that spec gloss workflow, but in my head, like it didn't really make so much sense to me, like using them together, especially when you get into like the complexity of how a metal material looks, or how something that's metal looks to something that's not metal. So like, obviously with that workflow, you're defining like the sort of size of the specular highlight on an object, which is the glossiness, and then the intensity of the specular highlight with the specular map. So that sounds simple, and it is, but it's like those two things are decoupled, and it might not be always obvious maybe why you have a value lighter or darker in one of those maps. Whereas to me, the metalness roughness workflow just makes so much more sense. It's so much more simple, and you don't really have to think about it as much. Basically, you just decide, is it metal or not? Sort of almost like a binary choice, yes, no, and you have a almost like you have a on or off mask, white or not white, white or black, sorry. And then the roughness is just like literally how rough is the surface, how much has it been polished, how much is it what the sort of surface faceting is like. Like rock obviously is going to be very, very rough, and a pool ball is going to be very smooth. It's just very obvious to anyone, I think, even if you're not used to like using 3D software, just how simple that is to understand. And also it's kind of industry standard now. I mean, there's a few engines that don't use it. I know that some engines maybe that don't use it, considering changing their workflows, but generally the metalness roughness workflow is industry standard for the most part. So it's probably best to learn that, at least within games. I'm not sure about like in film or but I'm pretty sure it's getting that way. So yeah, I would just go down that route if I had to suggest which one to choose.
Yeah. So from what I think from what we've seen too as well, it seems that metallic roughness tends to be more of the standard. Not that spec gloss isn't used often, and sometimes we even have combinate or different variations and so on. But yeah, metallic roughness is pretty much the kind of what's used standard. It's the standard shader that we use in both Designer and Painter as well.
Yeah. No, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, so Chris, I guess we'll wrap things up. We're just right at an hour and a half. So again, I just want to thank you a ton, Chris, for hanging with me here today and walking through this material. The work that you've done has just been truly inspiring. You know,
Awesome.
myself, it's been really a cool privilege to be able to hang here with you. And like I said, I learned a ton myself just watching you walk through your graph. I know everyone here in the chat was very enthusiastic as well about what you were sharing. So again, thank you very much, Chris, for sharing your time.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Also, I want to thank everyone in the chat as well for joining us and for asking questions. As always, we are open in our forum. So if anything that you have further questions, yeah, just post them in our forum. Also, Vincent posted in the chat thread our Discord community link. So be sure to join that as well. And we're all very active in those communities. And if you have any questions or anything, just post them there, and we'll definitely get back to you. So, Chris, I guess we'll let you go here, man. Get you to work. And yeah, man, you have a good rest of the day. And again, Chris, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it was awesome, and yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. I haven't really done this before, but it's nice to do it.
Yeah, very well done, man. Great explanations.
Awesome.
All right,
Thank you very much.
Chris. Take care.
Okay, bye.